Welcome back, guys, to video lecture number 3. This again deals with the powers of Congress. I hope that you've been able to follow along and take some good notes. And again, we'll see about some good questions too. So I'm really anxious to hear any questions, or maybe not. I'm not sure this material is that challenging. But nevertheless, no question is too small or insignificant to be raised and discussed. So the last time we were talking about the different non-legislative powers of the House, and you can see that up there. That is a subpoena there that you see in the picture, although it's not easy to know that. But since I made the slide, I can tell you that that's what that is. So we had talked about the fact that both houses of Congress, Senate and the House of Representatives, are able to form committees to use their committees to investigate and hold hearings on different matters, legislative matters and otherwise. We also talked about the power of the House of Representatives to, in fact, elect or select a president if there is no majority in the Electoral College. And that hasn't happened since 1824. It almost happened in 2000, as I said before. The Senate, on the other hand, has the power to choose a vice president if no candidate gets a majority of the Electoral College. I don't think that's ever happened. Don't anticipate that it will. But the other job that the Senate does have that is very important is to provide advice and consent on executive and judicial branch appointments made by the president. The Senate must also approve treaties that the president may negotiate with other nations. And this is quite important and very critical. And in the last 25 to 30 years, there's been more and more attention paid to this idea of advice and consent, in particular with regards to judges, in particular the Supreme Court, but also the different circuit judges at the federal level, and also different appointments that the president makes to serve in his cabinet at the secretary level. So secretaries of state, of defense, of commerce, of you name it. There have often been, especially when you have a president of one party and a Senate led by, senators in the opposite party, the Republican Party, who really don't agree with the president. And remember, the rules of the Senate are very different from the House, such to the extent that even one senator has an ability to really hold up any kind of nomination by putting a hold on a nomination, which is a procedure, a technical procedure using rules of the Senate, where one senator simply says, look, I have a problem. I'm placing a hold on this or that nomination. There's also the filibuster. We saw that most recently with what wasn't a filibuster, but Ted Cruz trying to play the role of Mr. Smith Comes to Washington in an overnight filibuster that wasn't a filibuster, but nonetheless, senators have in the minority party, in this case, the Republicans are today the minority in the Senate, they have an awful lot of power that they can wield in terms of blocking appointments. So this idea of consent, advice and consent, is really important and powerful. In fact, the Senate just rewrote its rules even in December to take away some of the powers of individual senators to block nominations. So we will see more on that front as time progresses. Okay, hold on. Here comes Mrs. King in the middle of a painting. Okay, I'm back. Sorry for the brief interruption. So we're going to move on now to limits on the power of Congress, and that'll be the last topic that we take up in this series of video lectures on the Congress. The Constitution was meant to create a stronger federal government, correcting the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. However, the framers were also fearful of concentration of power in a national government, and that really kind of goes back to the suspicion that many of the founding fathers in that time period, that is the Revolutionary War time period, had of concentrated power. And they were thinking really of the English governmental model, where you had a king, the monarchy on one hand, the parliament on the other. The parliament was really, there was a House of Commons, but don't be fooled by that. This was not a democratic form of government by any stretch of the imagination. Power was really invested in the hands of an elite class, the aristocracy, and wealthy merchants, and in addition, the king. So there was still a great deal of mistrust and suspicion on the part of the founders and many in the now new states of the United States. And we know that from some of the discussions at the actual Constitutional Convention and some of the debates about how to distribute power, to balance power, how to check power. And in fact, the framers did include this idea of separation of powers into the different branches, judicial, the legislative, and the executive branch. And they also, then we know that the judicial branch with Marbury versus Madison, the 1803 decision, claimed or staked out the prerogative of judicial review, where it could review the acts of the other branches of Congress, testing them against the Constitution, making that determination of what the Constitution actually said and meant. And in another sense, if you look at the president, the executive branch had the veto power, so that if Congress passed a law, that is both the House and the Senate passed a law, sent it to the president, and he disagreed, he could veto it. Now, the Senate and the House, that is the Congress, could override the president's veto. So, therefore, you have another power that Congress has, that it can override presidential vetoes. So that's really kind of an interesting feature of our government. Now, this doesn't happen often. In fact, lately, the last several presidents, there have been very few vetoes, and I don't think, to my knowledge, there have been any overrides of vetoes, but nonetheless, that is a power. So in addition to limitations that are built into the system of checks and balances that I've just described, the Constitution also contains in Article 1, Section 9, again, Article 1, Section 9, specific language. For example, Congress was forbidden from prohibiting the slave trade until 1808. Congress was also prohibited from making laws that might favor one or another state's ports, from placing tax on articles exported from any state. Rather technical language. The Constitution also included several clauses that protected people's basic civil rights. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2 bars Congress from suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is a Latin expression meaning having a body, and it's what gives you rights if you are detained by law enforcement, by police. You have certain rights if you are detained, and they can't be suspended by Congress. So that is that the government cannot hold people arbitrarily based on whatever considerations the government might have. And again, you've got to go back to the European idea and practices. That was very common in Europe for the king's justice, if you will, to arrest people arbitrarily, hold them against their will, not specify why they were being held, and so people didn't enjoy their rights. Now, that's not necessarily true of England. I should specify that the English passed a habeas corpus law in 1688, 1689. But if you go to the continent of Europe, that was fairly common practice. So the founding fathers wanted to avoid that kind of thing. Another timeout, guys. Okay, back again to wrap up here. Sorry about the interruptions. The never-ending painting project with Benjamin trying to paint the walls, never a good idea. At any rate, we just talked about the writ of habeas corpus. That's something that the Constitution protects, that basic fundamental civil liberty. We also see that Congress cannot pass a bill of attainder. And a bill of attainder is a law that punishes a person without a trial. So when you are, if you are, not suggesting that any of you will be, I hope, but if you are detained by the police, you have certain rights. That's habeas corpus. And one of those basic rights that we also know from the Bill of Rights is the right to a fair and speedy trial. So there can be no bill of attainders in the United States, and again, that was something that did happen elsewhere in the world. And ex post facto laws, again, another Latin expression, which means that a person cannot be held accountable for an action that took place in the past before a law was passed outlawing that action. So let me just say that again. Ex post facto laws state that a person cannot be held accountable for an action that wasn't a violation of a law at the time. So if Congress were to pass a law, 20 years from now, outlawing the wearing of I don't know, a certain type of dress, I couldn't be held accountable for breaking that law today in the past. So that's, in other words, it's to protect people from laws that are passed in the future so that they cannot be tried after the fact. So we see that there are certain limitations on Congress that include separation of powers. We know that already very well. The sections in the Constitution denying powers to Congress, and we see those in Article 1 and Section 9. That limit the powers of Congress. And again, this was all done to promote the new government, to create protections for the people, by the people, from a too powerful government. And again, what's interesting, I think, today, we've seen over the last several hundred years, the United States has been in existence, an increasing trend and a pattern towards ever greater concentrations of power in the federal government, that the government has expanded its authorities using something like the Necessary and Proper Clause, or even Supreme Court rulings that have been handed down to overturn certain practices that had been longstanding, such as segregation, separate but equal facilities in public places, transportation, and schools. So there have been a number of areas where the government has expanded its reach, and this has caused, I think, in the last 15 to 20 years, a real reaction that's very fascinating to witness and to study and to learn about, with the Tea Party movement. The Libertarian movement is another movement. Rand Paul, who's a senator from Kentucky, and Ron Paul, his father, is a congressman from Texas. So there's a lot of discussion and debate, which I think is really healthy in a democracy such as ours, about the size and purpose of government. And in fact, the question is, has our government gotten too big, too powerful, too invasive, too pervasive? One thinks of the NSA leaks, the Snowden case, where the NSA has been, in fact, collecting data. That phrase they use today, metadata. It sounds so spooky and scary. Well, should the government collect all this data on our daily lives as we talk to each other, text each other, Instagram each other? I don't even know what Instagram is, but I hear about it all the time. And so one wonders whether the government has, in fact, gotten too big and too powerful, or one wonders whether, in fact, we need a strong, robust government to provide basic protections and a basic standard of life, quality of life, that the free market system has not been able to provide. So that's a big question. It's an essential question, meaning that there's really no clear-cut answer. There are lots of different answers, so there's a myriad of different answers we can look at. That the Founding Fathers tried to create a system that was flexible, that gave the government powers that it desperately needed. And again, think about the Articles of Confederation and the weaknesses in that document. Think about the practices in Europe that then kind of scared the Founding Fathers into trying to limit or restrain the government, the Bill of Rights, that first 10 amendments, plus Article 1, Section 9. So we will now kind of take a look just briefly at some of the things I mentioned. The power of the government has expanded over time. Well, when the Founding Fathers wrote the document, there was nothing in anybody's minds that we would have a man on the moon or be able to send rockets into space with satellites and manned expeditions into space. So, the government has created, for example, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, that was in large part in response to the Soviet advances in space. We wanted to keep up with the Soviets, so we had to create a government agency. So here's another example of the government getting ever stronger. And again, as a result of the Cold War, we have the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947 that gave great powers to the government to collect data, mine data, analyze data, and carry out operations both covert, that is in secret and overt, that is, in the open, throughout the world to promote and defend our interests and protect our security. Of course, the recent events of 9/11 have led to the Patriot Act that has been reauthorized, and the creation of the Homeland Security Department that you guys investigated in a web quest. So we see that as times change, the government changes, and in order to meet the needs, and one wonders whether this will ever, in fact, stop. Thank you.